Hi, everybody. Welcome into tonight's Film Studies online discussion, where we will be discussing the Roaring Twenties, which was suggested and introduced and offered context by my colleague, BMFI Special Programming Manager, Jacob Mazer. Jacob, how are you tonight?
I'm well, Andrew. Good to see you and good to see everybody who's joining us. I'm looking forward to talking about this film.
Well, I'm always glad when someone suggests a movie and that person isn't me, because I feel like I always force my tastes on other people. But I was especially glad that you recommended this one because, as we were saying a bit ago, Raoul Walsh is a Hollywood director with whom I am not as well acquainted as many others. And this movie was a real sort of breath of fresh air if you think you know Hollywood movies of 1939, which was a particularly big year, or you think you know the gangster film from its very popular run 10 years prior to the release of this one. This movie is an eye-opener and has some very interesting takes on the period in general. So I'm really glad that we saw it. Before we get too much into things, though, just let me reiterate the procedures. Please keep your audio on mute until I call on you to ask your question or make your comment. I will know to call on you because you will please hopefully use the raise hand function within Zoom, which you can see marked the number 2 on your screen. We also will have our chat running. We would love for you to introduce yourselves in the chat, and especially if you are new to our discussions. Our colleague Jill will be monitoring the chat, and if anything sort of bubbles up there that the larger group should be made aware of, she'll be sure to let us know. And we would love to hear what everybody thinks and has to say about the movie. All right, let's see. It looks like we have some of the usual suspects ready to go right off the bat, including our first up, the Glusmans. Hello, Glusmans.
Hello, how are you?
Hello, Andrew. We've missed you.
Oh, that's very nice. It's good to hear you and to picture you talking.
Yeah, Jacob can picture us a little better, although we've seen each other on screen.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so Jacob, this was certainly for us a very interesting, trip back way before our time. And I liked it on a couple of levels. I love the filming, and I thought that when I put myself back into that time frame, how fresh this movie must have felt to the viewer when it first came out. That's something we've learned as members of the Bryn Film Institute on this thing, that we always have to remember what the audience was at the time, not just how we view it today. So I appreciate your choice at that level. Before I go into my 1 or 2 comments, I had to just sort of laugh, Jacob. You sort of implied at the beginning, because of the requirements of the day, everybody's got to get their comeuppance. And my father-in-law, may he rest in peace, used to say for some of these movies, everybody died at the end but the ushers. And in some respects, this was one of those films that Al would have enjoyed in that regard. But and Janice is sitting here next to me giggling. One of the interesting things that I thought about, in addition to great character actors and how some of these people continue to go on in their careers, and I certainly wouldn't mind having you tie that together. But one of the things I thought was very interesting was the true social commentary on the people and our country at the time, that lead in to what became the constitutional amendment for prohibition, and separate from the gangsters and separate from the gin rink running and all that, the commentary that was really woven through this on how we as a country sort of made a mistake, how certain parts of our country tried to rule the way the rest of us were thinking and doing, and the morality. And I was wondering, I did a little research. I couldn't find a ton on it, but I did see some of the commentators over the last 20 or 30 years making that kind of reference. And I was wondering if you had any background on how it was written with regard to the intent for social commentary or not. And again, thank you. This was great. Janice and I followed up with the African Queen this weekend on our own, and just the combination of the two and timing and everything else. We're loving movies so much more than we did 20 months ago.
Well, that's really good, and we're certainly very glad to hear it. That's one of the reasons that we're all here, and that's what drives us to do what we do. Jacob and I were talking a little bit about the sort of political or social commentary of the film, and I have a few thoughts, but I'd like to give Jacob first crack if he would care to jump in.
Certainly, and thanks for your comments, David and Janice. And I'm glad it sounds like a good Humphrey Bogart double feature. Fun to see him at a earlier part in his career, sort of pre-leading man stardom, and then later on as a more established male lead. So I think you've really hit the nail on the head. One of the things that I think makes the Roaring Twenties such a compelling film and such a notable entry in the gangster film genre is because it's not just, a sort of adrenaline-packed, action movie crime saga. It has that element, but it really seats it inside of a historical arc. And it is really trying to, I think, frame that phenomenon of the gangsterism inside, the social context. Now, the film came out in 1939, which takes place, after Prohibition has ended, and after the Depression is more or less over. So it's looking back at this period with perspective, which I think is important. This is something that it has on the earlier gangster films of the 1930s, which were very much more of their time without that historical perspective. What I think, we can continue to develop this thought over the course of our conversation, but briefly, one of the things that I think is the most fascinating is that the film really establishes a vector for the development of gangsterism, for this character Eddie Bartlett's move into the criminal realm, that is really one that is shaped by the social factors. We see him come back from the war. We see him, and more explicitly with his comrade George, bringing home this sort of exposure to violence and this comfort with violence that they've developed during the war. We see them falling into this sort of lost generation lifestyle where they're sort of excluded from, they've served their country and they've come back and found themselves excluded from the economy and excluded from, let's say, social respectability. And, we see interestingly, we see the beginning of, Eddie's gangster journey forming basically along the lines of very conventional American entrepreneurship. There's a supply, he finds a demand, and he furnishes it. It seems at this time that, he seems to be doing a service for people, and it's not so laden with violence and corruption. But of course, things thicken, things sour, things escalate, and the saga grows, more bloody and more troubling, and his hands, grow more and more undeniably dirty. Certainly, the Depression factors into it too, and into some of the changes that happen to that character. But I'll leave it there for now. And Andrew, I'm interested to hear your perspective on the subject.
Yeah, I mean, I think this movie is undeniably of the time in which it was made, which is, something I always talk about, and something that I particularly appreciate, sort of coming to film studies through the lens or from the avenue of American history. Hollywood in the 30s, certainly in the 30s after Roosevelt was elected, was very eager to be viewed positively by the president and his administration. And I am not saying that this movie contains dialogue or narration that was specifically included or geared to curry favor with the Roosevelt administration. I'm not really familiar with Mark Hellinger's, the source, sort of the author of the source story, his political persuasion. But I will say that Hollywood was very smart, and they knew that whether it was sort of eventually agreeing to the production code by 1934, agreeing to it and enforced it by 1934, which was, at least for a time, a pet project of the president's mother, among many, many others, to making sure that they depicted the Soviet Union in a positive light by the dawn of the 40s, and when America was involved with the Soviet Union as allies in World War II. They were very eager because they saw the government under Roosevelt heavily regulating industry. And the National Cover Administration was very interested in the movie business and very involved in the goings on there on a host of fronts. And so they were very determined to make sure that they were clearly on the right side of every issue as the Roosevelt administration saw it. So, you know, as I said to Jacob before we started, there's actually a line in this movie in the voiceover that says, you know, Franklin Roosevelt rode his platform of ending prohibition to the White House. And that wasn't really one of the highlights I was taught in high school or college of what led to FDR's victory and what led to his re-elections. I would be surprised if it's in the top 5, but the notion that he was somehow going to restore order to a process that had run amok is obviously how this film views prohibition. It views America before Roosevelt as not caring very much about those who are less fortunate, including returning soldiers. It talks about or depicts a very dog-eat-dog world that the gangsters are able to take advantage of. And you'll notice, of course, that a gentleman, you know, ethical, if very ill-tempered or short-tempered gangster like Jimmy Cagney is the type of gangster that is able to thrive at a time when, if you're a criminal, you're not really that bad because you're only breaking the laws of the previous administration. But once Roosevelt comes in, it takes the rare, truly cutthroat criminal of a Humphrey Bogart type in this film to be willing to even break those laws. And there are words to that effect mentioned later in the film as well. I think that David's point about, you know, some of the country telling the rest of the country how to live, I really can't say that applies here. I mean, if every major divisive issue that you might apply that to in the last 20 or 30 years had gone through the constitutional amendment process, then maybe that would be a more potent critique in my view. But say what you want about prohibition, it was enacted through the constitutional amendment process, which, as we all know, is very difficult to achieve. It was also undone that way, which meant that just as many people who found it to be a good idea later saw what it was doing and found it to be a bad idea. That's how those things should work, in my opinion. But I don't think there's too many parallels to the present day. But I do think it's a film that has a surprising amount of political and social commentary. And I think the part of the way it's allowed to do that during this time when Hollywood didn't often do that was because it was on the right side of the powers that be at the time of its release. Let's see. Lillian, you have a question or comment? Lillian, if you can unmute, we would love to hear what you have to say. Or anyone else. Well, if Lillian's still there, I'm not sure, but if anyone else has any comments or questions, we'd love to hear from them. The Hirshes. What say you, Hirshes?
Hello. Hello, Andrew. Hello, Jacob.
Hello.
Yes. Nice to be back with you guys. So a couple of things, starting with the most trivial first. I went to Mineola High School. So nice to see a shout out for Priscilla Lane as Jean Sherman. Mineola looked a lot nicer in this movie than I remember my experience there, but that's for another evening. I had 3 questions, and I think they're tied together and not just rambling. I was interested in your thoughts about the contrast between the Gene Sherman character and Panama Smith, which seemed to me very central to the story, and the triangle with Jimmy Cagney. Not only about their difference in temperament, like, you know, she's sort of like the good girl in high school, and 3 years later, she's now like in a chorus line, but she gets involved with him, and it's fuzzy. You know, it's not so clear that she's like so pure. She knows what he's doing, and she's willing to take what she can take. And he says that to her at the very end of the movie. So I'm interested in your thoughts about the contrast between the two of them. I'm interested in your thoughts about the contrast between the Roaring Twenties as uproarious and as moralizing. So what I'm tying these two together with is pulls in opposite directions with the center not so obvious. And the third question, your thoughts, because Barb and I were having the same conversation. 1939, this introduction, you know, with the sort of scripted thing by the author saying, in the distant future, we may face the. If that's an overture towards knowing the US is likely going into the war, it seems to me part of the message was, so we're going to probably go into a war again. We're going to probably come out, you know, on the other side, you know, as the victors again. I don't know. Let's not make the same mistake when people come back from that war that we made with this one. So those are the 2.5 or 3 things I'd be interested in your thoughts on, especially about the Gene Sherman and Panama Smith characters. I have to say, I love the Panama Smith character. I thought like she was the dot that kept connecting the threads of the various scenes. And when you sort of wandered a bit, like they came back around to her, even if only briefly.
Jacob, do you want to jump in with any of those?
Certainly. Let's start with Gene and Panama. An interesting contrast. I was thinking about this as I was rewatching the film in preparation for this discussion. And I was also thinking a little bit about why Eddie goes for Gene rather than Panama, who in many ways seems like a better fit for him. To me, I wonder if Eddie doesn't fixate on Gene because she represents a piece of his life where it seemed like there was a different possibility about how his destiny would go, you know, where she was, you know, the girl, even if it was just a sort of, you know, projection of who she would be. But to this girl who was writing to him, you know, from the home front while he was at war, to whom he might go home to and have a normal life, you know, on the straight and narrow. And he keeps, you know, she has a, he's hooked on her, you know, even though there's plenty of signs that it's probably not going to work out the way he wants. And even though that there's, you know, probably another potential partner who might be better suited. And this to me, I think speaks to one of the themes, you know, of the film, which is this kind of this desire for respectability, you know, and the question of what is respectable and what isn't. This seems to be the thing that Eddie's seeking a little bit, you know. He's I think he feels disrespected when he comes home. He feels like somebody who should be, you know, honored and celebrated by society, or somebody who's earned that right. He finds himself in a kind of business that's a little dirty, and he feels self-conscious about it. And throughout the film, we see him trying to kind of legitimize himself or boost his status, you know. You know, we see him moving from selling cheap hooch into trying to get, you know, expensive liquor and stuff. So to bring it back around to the women, you know, I think the two women represent, you know, not only these, you know, two romantic options for Eddie, but also these sort of diverging paths, you know, about success, you know, in America. You know, one that's sort of more traditional, idyllic, wholesome route. The other being a sort of grittier, grimier, but maybe in some ways, you know, I think Panama is an interesting person and has a lot of virtue too. And, you know, and Eddie being sort of caught between these two things, or unable to sort of make peace with the course that he's on. Just as a final note, I think one curious, parallel that we see between these two characters too is that they're both singers, and Gene sings these kind of wholesome, almost like cornily innocent songs, like "I'm Just Mad About Harry," or "It Had to Be You," or whatever. Songs that like seem almost cheeky, like singing a song that sweet in like a speakeasy. Whereas, when we hear Panama singing, she's singing songs about, we see her in the broken down saloon at the end singing, and she's singing songs about, hard times and the old saloon and all that. And so, she's somebody who I think is sort of at peace with where she is in the world in a way that Eddie isn't. And that's some of the way that I see those two characters, playing off of each other. Andrew, your thoughts?
Well, I think I think Eddie plans for his life of crime to be temporary.
Yeah.
And he gives Jean, an engagement ring that she should hold on to until he's out of the life. And if he settles down with Panama, he is acknowledging that he has made his choice, and that is his life, and that is his life permanently. I think your point about him thinking he's intended for or entitled to better things is true. I think he would say he got into a life of crime because all other options were taken away from him, and because he was sort of, wrapped up in, unfairly, arrested and prosecuted for just delivering a package. He didn't have a choice, and this is sort of what the life the country or the society he came back to pushed him into. But he's not really a bad fella, and if he and he always sort of has his eye toward the sort of more respectable or legitimate world. Jacob, you said before we started that you had read somewhere that there were elements of this movie that were sort of an inspiration for The Godfather 3. And I think that we've stumbled onto one of the elements that would help make that case, namely that it's about a man who sort of insists, perhaps despite some evidence to the contrary, that he is only involved in a life of crime because others give him no choice, and that he will one day achieve the legitimacy that he has always aspired to, and to which he believes his family and his life is entitled. And so I think that's the biggest reason he doesn't settle down with Panama. And at the end, when they do seem to be sort of a de facto couple, there are other signs he's given up as well, his drinking and all that, the way he pretends not to sort of know Jean in the cab and everything. So, and I think there's a whole bunch of, sort of 30s and production code reasons why, she can't end up with him. And she has to choose the sort of, the Hollywood movies have always made the distinction between sort of the right kind of woman and the wrong kind of woman. And this movie makes that distinction very clear. And so there's certain things that there's certain lanes those two characters are going to stay in just because that's the era. And so I think that's sort of how that goes that route. I have to be honest, Richard, that Jacob and I have talked for so long that I don't remember your other questions, if you would care to remind us. Maybe you fell asleep.
No.
Okay.
You guys never put us to sleep. No, the third question was about the introduction overture, both narrated and printed on the screen, about in the distant future we may face the same kind of whatever. And let us hope we remember the lessons of this. So I'm thinking of the audience sitting in the theater in 1939. What the implications of that are, because as we said earlier, there is some sense here of backed into this life of mild crime, which becomes violent against his will, kind of thing. So that was my third question. But Andrew, can I tag something on if I'm not dominating here?
No, that's fine. No one else has their hand up, so it might as well be the Hirsh show. So go
okay.
ahead.
Well, let me tell you about Mineola High School.
Oh wait, I just saw a couple hands come up, so you don't have unlimited time, but you can certainly add another comment. Go ahead.
Actually, I knew when I said Mineola High School, someone else would raise their hand. I just was hoping you would comment on the character of Danny, who I also think is a triangle playing off of both of the women and Eddie, and in many ways seems to me the clearest love relationship that Eddie has, the most uncompromised and the most straightforward. That horrible scene where he comes out of the nightclub after his body's been dumped in front is just so affecting. Anyway, so it was the audience and that overture, and if you want to comment on Danny's character.
Well, so the movie's release date was October 28th, 1939. And I'm, as I've said before, I'm not an expert in American history. I think that by that time, there was probably, the likelihood of American involvement in World War II had probably ratcheted up a bit. I think Poland had been invaded by then. I can't remember the status of Britain, Britain's involvement with the war at that time, but we know that Roosevelt wanted to get involved. If people accept my sort of description that this is a rather pro-Roosevelt film, then it would make sense that it was sort of laying the groundwork toward that. I have to say that outside of this film, I'm not very familiar with the narrative that there was a rise of organized crime and Tommy guns and violence in the streets because soldiers returning from World War I were not sufficiently or appropriately welcomed home. I mean, I've never heard that narrative. And so that seems to be part of the case this movie's making, which, if it's making that case, then there's really sort of no reason to make that. There's only two reasons to really sort of suggest that, right? Even sort of broadly or subtly, right? One is to make Roosevelt seem even more wonderful than he would from the other elements of the film that sort of suggest his wonderfulness. The other is what you're suggesting, Richard, that people would not be surprised. People were anticipating that there would be, I won't say another world war, but that American troops may be called up again, and let's learn the lesson. I also think that this movie is very invested in, for what we would now today call a sort of rip from the headlines cred, and giving it a sort of broader or larger political or historical relevance only helps sort of stack the deck in favor of it having that cred. So, whether the author of the source material really was sort of prescient in that way, or just thought, this is a social, the more substance this film can have, the more latitude it will be given in its content, and the more taken more seriously it will be by the studio and critics. And so let's put some more of that in there. I think we can't discount a cynical motive like that one. Jacob.
I can speak to a different angle of the overture as well, which is that one of the charges that was leveled against the gangster film genre throughout its golden age, especially during its most popular run in the early 1930s, was that it glamorized crime. And people who were making these films, especially as the code came into effect, were very sensitive about trying to maneuver that, and trying to counter, or at least give themselves some plausible deniability about that charge. So in fact, if you go back and look at gangster films from this period, and even a couple from the early 30s, I think Scarface has one too, and The Public Enemy might as well, these like really early classic ones. It's pretty common to see these sort of overtures that say, we are demonstrating these events to raise awareness about this issue with the hope that our government or whoever takes action and, deals effectively, with this issue of crime.
To stop the scourge.
Right. Right,
Yeah.
right. And then sort of proceeds to show these gangsters who are like, you know, making it happen, looking glamorous, becoming style icons, and, you know, in many ways, you know, are glamorized in the film. I've heard this phenomenon. This is not, you know, an original coinage, but I've heard this phenomenon referred to as the "don't you dare do this cool thing" syndrome. You know, where a film will, a film or a piece of media will sort of glamorize something that might, you know, be illicit or be kind of shady, but stamp on, you know, some kind of overt moralizing message about it to, you know, make the case that they're not in fact glamorizing it, but in fact only showing it to demonstrate the harm of such lifestyles, even though, you know, the characters come off looking pretty cool. This film, I think, is more measured. As we said, this film comes later in the gangster saga, and I think the sort of tragic arc of the character is hits home a little harder, to my mind at least, and maybe does sort of reckon with the sort of destructiveness of the you know, of the lifestyle and the phenomenon, you know, with more gravity than other works in the genre. But long story short, these sort of overtures were almost a staple of the genre. So that was probably at least one aspect going into it as well.
Tom, you have a question or comment? Okay, well, while we wait to hear from Tom, if we do hear from Tom, there was a comment made in the chat section about
Oops,
the.
I'm sorry. I was
That's
muted.
okay. Go ahead.
I'm old enough to still have to think about that. Anyway, I love listening to the sort of intellectual part of this, but I have to tell you, I've never signed into one of these before. And the reason why I did, because the Roaring Twenties growing up was one of my favorite movies. I mean, I grew up in Central Jersey where we had, I don't know, it was Channel 9 or Channel 11, but there was something called the $1 Million Movie.
Yep.
And the same movie would play for a week. And so I would watch the Roaring Twenties and all of the other Raoul Walsh movies and just loved it to death. And when I saw that you were doing this, I had to sign up for this. Just from pure entertainment value. I love this movie. I love the end. I love the, you know, he used to be a big shot. I mean, it's just, you know, fist pump to chest. It was great stuff. The whole like almost pieta, you know, where Panama's holding him in the snow and the cop says, what was his business? It's just really, really wonderful stuff. And, you know, it relates to, I guess it was Andrew talking about Godfather 3. I really never thought about that, but there's the whole scene where somebody died in front of the opera house on the steps, right? That I thought was there may be some parallel there. But just, I don't want to go on and on, but let me just mention one thing, and that is that, you know, the Raoul Walsh movies are fabulous. And today in the Wall Street Journal, interestingly enough, there was an article about the fact that Criterion is coming out with a new version of High Sierra. The article is very interesting if people can find it, because it compares Roy Earl in High Sierra and his relationship with Ida Lupino to the Panama Smith Eddie Bartlett relationship in this movie. And I think just between that movie and, you know, Angels with Dirty Faces and Crime School and all the other stuff that I grew up with in my teens watching on television is just great. So thank you guys. I just wanted to make sure like a true fan of the movie got in there and threw that out to you. So
No, we're glad you did, and you know, please don't misunderstand our sort of, you know, trip through the annals of history as trying to.
Oh, not at all. I really
Because-
enjoyed that. I really enjoyed that because when I watched it again this time, I saw the beginning where maybe I didn't sort of just ran through it before while I was getting cookies and milk or something. I don't know, but it's great. Thanks.
But no, it is a very entertaining film. And, you know, I said to Jacob before we started that I noticed in the opening credits, a couple of people were credited for special effects. And That wasn't something you typically saw in gangster movies. And then I saw all the sort of very, vivid visualizations of the depression and the montages for the crime and the newsreel, mimicking that newsreel aesthetic. By the way, opening with a newsreel in a fiction film 2 years before Citizen Kane did it, which I think is interesting. And so there's a lot, to recommend this film sort of in a formal sense and in an entertainment sense. And I can only imagine, I guess I'm sort of inured to it a bit because I've been watching movies from, the 30s and 40s for decades now, but I can only imagine, if your idea of a movie from 1939, let's say, is Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, or even, relatively speaking, Stagecoach, which I think is outstanding. This movie must have seemed like a real breath of fresh air. And we should remember that, certainly. I agree.
Yeah. I appreciate your comments, Tom. Absolutely. This is a work of first-rate entertainment, I think. And we should take a minute to talk about just how slick Raoul Walsh is as a filmmaker. Think about how much this movie's an hour 40 and change, something like that. And it manages to cover several, a decade's worth of action, war, coming home, a rise, a fall, and a redemption, different stages of characters' lives. And to my mind, it does it without anything feeling rushed. This is enough content to fill, 2 movies, 3 movies, a whole saga. Walsh is so slick. He makes it move so fast, but it's effective enough that the characters, feel whole, that the scenes feel like real dramatic scenes, and that we feel the gravity of the rise and fall arc of the protagonist and his redemption. The final scene, the Pieta scene, running through the snow, absolutely iconic stuff. I also appreciate your mentioning High Sierra. A little bit of exposition here. So Raoul Walsh would make, I think in is it 40 or 41, Andrew? Maybe you can help me out here. But he would make a gangster film called High Sierra, which was Humphrey Bogart's first role as—
I think it's 41.
Yeah, it's Bogart's first role as a leading man. High Sierra, and to some extent, I think there's traces of it in the Roaring Twenties too. These are films that sort of illustrate in some ways the transition from the gangster film into the film noir as the sort of, preeminent paradigm of the crime film. We can see the sort of personas, these sort of like somewhat romantic, tough guy, anti-hero, figures, these charismatic anti-heroes being developed and, in coming up through this cycle of gangster films, and that will, come to form one of the core elements of the film noir. Many of the actors, Bogart being, the huge one, who would become stars of gangster films, began their careers, or would become stars of film noir, began their careers working in gangster films. And I made a comment to this effect in my introduction, but there are some who claim that in many ways, Jimmy Cagney really opened up a space for Bogart to become a leading man. Cagney playing these sort of appealing, tough guys who were often kind of villains, and doing it charismatically with a lot of panache and a lot of verve and a lot of dynamism. We'll see that sort of character, be for that sort of presence and that sort of stock type sort of be developed further by Bogart, during the 1940s in his noir work. So it's an interesting connection to make, and thank you for making it, Tom.
Yeah, I think this movie, if you want to wonder why Warner Brothers thought Humphrey Bogart could play Sam Spade in The Maltese Falcon, a character who does some pretty unsavory things and seems to be pretty, almost shockingly at times, insensitive and unsentimental. here's one. I know there are others, but here's one example of where they got the idea that he could pull that off, because he's still compelling to watch, and you're not willing to or don't want to write him off entirely, even though he's clearly the most despicable man in the whole movie. So I think that's interesting, and of course I think Cagney opens up a space for Bogart in other ways as well, because Cagney, I don't want to say he moves away from this area, this type of film entirely, because he comes back with White Heat at the end of the 40s, but he's also playing George M. Cohan in 1942, so he's clearly moving on to some lighter things, and so that opens up a space for Bogart as well. There were a couple of things brought up in the chat that I thought we should get to. Steve talked about he talked about the way the armistice is handled in the World War I portion opening of the film, where basically they're fighting literally right up to the armistice, and they get one more German soldier that they can kill, who appears to be a teenager, literally sort of right before the armistice is called. And I think that this is sort of a piece with, to me, the most shocking thing in the movie, which was the very cynical depiction of World War I. That this is, basically it's 20 years after the war ends, but, this is Hollywood made Sergeant York, right? And they're now sort of showing World War I as, this really just this fool's errand, where the soldiers aren't particularly honorable. They're not particularly good at their jobs. They don't seem to be given really any sort of, they don't have a lot of faith in their command, right? Even those immediately above them, let alone the other ones. The slapstick of everyone's cigarettes getting ruined in the foxholes, which I thought was interesting also, because Bogart basically says a line similar to, of all the foxholes and all the wars and all the world, you fall into mine.
You had to somersault into mine.
Yeah, right. But I think what Steve's pointing out about the German soldier right before, I think that's just of a piece with the real cynical depiction of the war, and that really surprised me. In retrospect, having noticed how the film sort of is positioning itself politically, it doesn't strike me as entirely surprising, but it still was, particularly to open the film that way, because the license they felt to criticize the American military, even the American military under a different administration from 20 years earlier, still surprised me for a film from 1939. Jacob, did you have any additional thoughts on that sort of that opening depiction of what World War I was like for American soldiers?
Sure. I kind of wanted to bring it back to where we began our conversation, which is how the film sort of braids together the development of these characters and their criminal lifestyle, into events that were happening, on a macro level to this whole generation of guys. One thing that I was really struck by is how explicit the film makes the connection between the violence that happens on the battlefield and the violence that will eventually happen on the city streets and in gang wars and so forth. We see we see, and I think the fact that we see the armistice declared, it's like in one moment we see, in 1 minute we see Bogart, shooting down another man, and this is appropriate for that situation. 1 minute later, it's not appropriate, but he's still the same guy. He holds the rifle and says, I think I'll take this with me. And I think one of the things that we have to wonder is, was that character a bad apple? Was he always a sadistic guy? Or, were those tendencies developed or at least exacerbated and sharpened, by the experience with wartime violence? This sort of gets, we get a sort of another example of this when Cagney's in jail for a moment, and he's talking to a guy who who was at war and has turned to crime. In part, probably because of economic desperation. I think he says as much. But also, these are guys who've had to go to war, who've had to condition themselves to exist in a violent existence, and then have come home with that, that quality, and probably what we now know to be that sort of trauma doesn't go anywhere just because the armistice is declared. So, I think it's a clever observation, Steve, and I'm glad you brought it up.
Also in the chat, the Hirsches reminded us that we didn't get around to talking about Danny. And I think you see this a lot in Hollywood movies in general, particularly of this period, that there's this sort of character who's kind of outside of the main endeavor, the main plot, but through the contrast they provide, it sort of reflects something back on the main character. And of course, Danny is a huge part of reminding us that the Cagney character has some humanity and comes from a real place and is sort of a real guy. The only, Bogart doesn't have any friends that he's brought along. He doesn't have any people to keep him sort of sentimentally grounded. And I think that, I agree that the sort of the death of Danny and the way that happens, in a way, it's sort of not only sort of foreshadows Cagney's own death, also sadly on the sidewalk where someone who cares about him has to sort of watch it happen. But it also, to me, was a really sure indication that things were never going to work out with Gene, because the thing that gave Cagney a chance at remembering what it was like to be a sort of normal person, he's gone away.
Yeah.
Did you have thoughts on Danny?
Yeah, poor Danny. Danny's an innocent. We feel, or I feel for, the gangster characters too, or the more, involved gangster characters. But they're guys who've put themselves on the board. They're guys who've really put themselves in the game and sort of know what they're getting into, and at least seem to, intellectually accept the stakes. Danny's in there because he's a friend, and he's trying to make a living. He's collateral damage, and in a way, Danny probably is a stand-in for, plenty of other innocent people who die, like in the course of these. One of the things that we see over the course of the film is, the bootlegging operation, which at the beginning seems illegal, but like a victimless crime, letting people who want something buy what they want, turns sour. It goes bad. It gets corrupted. Everybody wants power. Everybody wants the edge, and things turn ugly. And it starts to affect, innocent people too. Danny's a piece of that. He's there are a couple of other occasions in the film where we see kind of how civilians get wrapped up into it. I'm thinking particularly of the couple who sort of is forced to stay in the Italian diner, by Eddie's gangster rival, and was on scene for the shootout. And Danny isn't, Danny's in the life in a way. He's not a total civilian. But Danny's an innocent, or I think Danny's an innocent, and he really brings home this, that's when it starts to feel really like it's gone wrong. I mean, I think that's when Eddie has to really face that it's really gone wrong.
Yeah, and I also think, the movie shows us that Danny's not very bright. He sort of leads with his heart first, and that kind of vulnerability, was sort of, often is associated with, in a way, that vulnerability and that naivete and that sort of lowercase r romantic type of figure is a part of the Cagney character that, starts out with him in the film when he goes to see Jean, but eventually goes away. And of course, by the time once Danny's killed, it's completely gone from Eddie as well. Let's see. Dana, you have a question or comment?
This is just quick. I think can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay. I think it's really interesting that we've talked about every single character, and I don't believe anybody's mentioned the lawyer character.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I think and I don't think there's any accident about that, because he was utterly uninteresting and he was created to be uninteresting. So let's face it, there's 3 guys in the foxhole at the beginning, right? They're all having the same war experiences, basically. They all jump in at the same time. They make 3 different kinds of choices about how to go forward with life. Well, 2.5. 2 of them go the bad guy route. But then there's the lawyer who makes the really, he's above board all the time. Even when he's working with, he's in the gangster world. He's trying to be on the up and up with the cabs and everything else. And then he leaves it when it's no good. And he also gets the girl. And to me, Jean and the lawyer are both the extremely uninteresting. And I think that's saying something about what either the filmmaker, Raoul Walsh, or perhaps the script has to say about what we're to take away from this 30s picture. Good is not good in this movie. I mean, to be a good person is forgettable. Those, and one more quick thing about it. I found it really interesting that Jean was the one you mentioned, Jacob, that Jean sang 2 wonderful, they're actually great torch songs, Melancholy Baby, and, and it was really, what's her name? The other woman that I wanted to hear sing those songs, and she wasn't given them. It was the bland one who got to sing the good songs, and she sang them blandly. So again, it's just the interesting comment that just something really interesting about that other side of the coin. There are 3 coins here, and the side of the coin that we aren't talking about because it's not interesting is the good guy.
Yeah,
that's all.
Well, thanks for that, Dana. It sort of ties in with something that I think it was Steve mentioned in the chat about how, the assistant district attorney and his wife seem to be living very, very well, which is the question is that, are we meant to think that that's sort of all from his, pursuit of the law and his work with the government, or as Steve says, is there money left over from the past? See, I think Dana's comments and Steve's comments sort of come together because, in a way we're talking about how much this movie is, in many ways a step forward sort of cinematically and culturally from the gangster films of 10 years earlier. But I think a place where it sort of falls down is that it still wants us to want to, not us, it still wants its audience to want to be Jean and her lawyer husband. And I don't think we're meant to think so far into how they have the resources, except to say that theirs is a lifestyle that we're supposed to want to approve of and recognize and encourage and support. And if during the, it's toward the end, but if it's, during the Great Depression, if you just settle down and go work for the government, you're going to be fine. I don't think in a movie that in so many other ways is clearly trying to let us know that it's on board with the Roosevelt administration.
You're going to be fine, but you're going to be boring.
Right. No, and
they're boring.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And that's what it took me a long time, but that's sort of my tie back to the original gangster films, is they don't even realize, like, the people who made the gangster films in the end of the 20s and the very early 30s, sort of claimed that, don't do what these people do, but don't do what, as Jacob said, the style trendsetters, the most charismatic, the most exciting, the most daring people in the movie. Don't be like them. Be like all the other people who seem to try to want to foil them. This movie sort of undermines itself in the same way, because you're absolutely right. They are the least boring. But I honestly believe that at least in a sort of, manifest way, that is what the viewer is supposed to value and want to most emulate. But movies about people like that are not particularly interesting or exciting, and this movie sort of bears that out, because they were just a fraction of the screen time, and that nearly drove Dana to to give up on the whole thing. So, Jacob.
Yeah, I mean, I maybe have a slightly different take, which is, I agree. I mean, what's his name? George is like a Ken doll or something like that. He's tall, well put together, good looking, and completely surfaceless. He's featureless. Kind of. And Gene, has that same, Miss Wholesome thing going on. Even though they both, are threaded, into the criminal stuff, at least nominally. But, they're presented, I think, as these kind of ideals, maybe not so much to the audience, I don't know, but to Eddie. I think we as the audience associate with Eddie, or relate to Eddie, as somebody who feels like he falls short of the ideal, feels that he falls short of this, idealized template of, American manhood, American success. We relate to Eddie, who's the underdog. We relate to Eddie who covets that a little bit. And it also makes Eddie's faults and maybe tragic flaws comprehensible to us. Because Eddie, no matter how successful he gets, no matter how much money he's stacked up, no matter how much, fancy jewelry he can buy, no matter, how many girls, he can have if he wants them, no matter how many doors open for him at the club. Eddie inside feels like he falls short of that, and it gives him a blind spot. He wants to be with Gene. He seems to have this sort of inferiority complex. He seems to resent George a little bit the whole time, or be conscientious that George is probably has some quality that he himself lacks. And it gives him a blind spot, everybody but Eddie knows what's going on with Gene and George, he turns into a sucker, where do we see Eddie's, corrupt actions begin? It's not in the criminal arena originally. I mean, the first time we see Eddie kind of abuse his power is to get Gene a spot, as a singer, even though, she's not a terrible singer, but she's not a wonderful one either. This represents like a, Eddie's a striver, he's a striver who's never going to reach the ideal. Because it's, because it's an internal issue. And we relate to characters like that. I think that makes them more interesting. The other characters are surfaceless. Eddie's not surfaceless. Eddie's got depth. You look like you have a comment, Andrew.
I agree with what you're saying. And I don't think it necessarily contradicts what I was saying, because I think that in many cases, though not all, that what the protagonist of a movie wants is what the filmmakers or the powers that be envision its audience wants, which is one of the ways to foster identification. The other thing I would say is that putting Gene and the lawyer as this ideal makes Eddie's death all the more noble, because he dies the way he does when he does, essentially because he's trying to save them from being leaned on. So I think that's another element as well.
Yeah.
Um,
Can I add
go
one
ahead.
more comment to that, Andrew?
Yeah.
I just want to, we haven't talked much about Eddie's, last, actions. And I think I just want to, push off of that briefly while we have some time. But, right, everything we see Eddie do throughout the film is basically for himself, to build himself up. We can sympathize with, with the reasons that he does that, perhaps. But even the sort of generous gestures he makes, to Jean are basically sort of self-motivated. They're not actually out of genuine. It's because he's trying to get something for himself, which is her. At the end, he sort of makes an unselfish decision. He really he does something for somebody else where there really isn't anything in it for him. He knows at this point, now he's back to being a nobody, and he knows that there's sort of nothing for himself to gain, other than doing, what feels like the right thing to do. And, to that end, I think it earns this sort of tragic ending. It earns that like last image. He becomes a legitimately tragic figure, and I think it makes the sort of redemption angle of it, feel feel strong, feel impactful.
Before we get back to the Glusmans with our last question or comment of the night, I wanted to mention that in the chat, there was the Hirsch's mentioned, I don't know if you saw this, Jacob, that this is a movie about three different enlisted men who return from the war and sort of have different ends and kind of go on the same trajectory, but also different trajectories. The point being, of course, that Best Years of Our Lives has that triumvirate that does that as well. So do Always Fair Weather and Some Came Running. The question that I don't know the answer to, and I don't know if you know the answer, is this the first time we've sort of seen that? I don't consider it really that much of a forerunner to those, because I don't think the trajectories of the men are sufficiently different, but that might be a quibble. I'm wondering what you think about that point, Jacob.
Yeah, it's an interesting point of continuity. I don't know off the top of my head. I can't think of an earlier film that picks up that formula. Although I can certainly think of other subsequent films that fall in that. But it's a curious sort of through line that I hadn't considered before, and one I definitely need to chew on. I appreciate your bringing that to the table.
Well, I just like the idea, the suggestion that they made, because, I'm thinking about this. I've been thinking about this movie and sort of in its line, as it's in its place in the line of gangster films,
right?
Perhaps, as you were talking about, a sort of transitional film, maybe between sort of crime being gangster and crime being noir. But the notion of put of this in the category of post-American war films,
right?
Or GI coming back sort of subgenre, I think is interesting.
I agree. It's well observed.
Okay, Glusmans, what do you got?
Well, interesting from the beginning through, we've talked about an awful lot. And you briefly, I think, Andrew, mentioned Mark Hellinger, and if I'm mispronouncing his name, you'll fix it. But the dialogue, I think, and the way he appears to have written most of it, lends itself to what Jacob was describing as how, I think it was Jacob, how well this flows, and the hour and 40 something minutes, and how much gets covered. Hellinger's dialogue, and Tom made one comment about the very last, he read the last two lines in reverse order, but if you go to the last 5, 6, 7 lines, and it's sort of a classic, he's dead. Well, who is this guy? This is Eddie Bartlett. Well, how are you hooked up with him? I could never figure it out. And then what was his business? He used to be a big shot. Hellinger, if you read, as I went back when I was thinking about tonight, go back and look at snippets. He's got these really tight dialogue scenes that are perfect, both for the way Roll Welsh was directing and the cinematography. So, we've dwelled at different times over these months with how different parts of the technique are. And listening to our comment, they all fit together. And if the camera was going the other way, you'd see my two hands fitting together and the way the perfect fit between our fingers when you do that. And the writing, the directing, picking the actors. Not every actor could deliver these lines the way they're written. Cagney was perfect for delivering these lines, both the way Hellinger wrote them, I think, and the way Walsh told him, helped him to come in. These other actors, I think, all did a great job with it too. But if you listen, it's Cagney's voice that I think Hellinger is writing. So you said this will be the last comment, so I'll thank you for all of us listening here again. You've taught us a lot. You've entertained us. You've helped us entertain ourselves through many of these weeks and weekends. So as you finish up, thank you again. Thanks, BMFI.
Well, thanks so much for that, David. I do want to say that, Hellinger, I'm not sure, I'll say Hellinger because that's probably more common, was a columnist, a newspaper columnist who was hired by the Warner Brothers to sort of start churning out stories. So he created the source material for this, and he based it on some of his knowledge of the real underworld in New York when he was a columnist in New York City at that, during the sort of peak of the gangster era about 10 years before this movie came out. But he didn't write the screenplay. The screenplay was co-written by Jerry Wald, Richard Macaulay, and Robert Rossen. I don't know really anything about Richard Macaulay, but I can tell you Jerry Wald was a screenwriter who became a producer, who actually got promoted to producer at Warner Brothers based on Hellinger's recommendation, as it turns out. If Wald's name seemed familiar to you, it's because he goes on to produce and probably have a hand in writing some wonderful Joan Crawford films like Mildred Pierce and Humoresque, and a bunch of other sort of, very wonderful Warner Brothers movies that in their own rights have some snappy dialogue. And Robert Rossen is probably best known for co-writing and directing The Hustler, the 1961 movie that introduced us to Paul Newman as Fast Eddie Felson. So there are some very sharp pens working on the screenplay, but Hellinger, I think, just provided the source material and didn't actually contribute much, if any, of the dialogue. But I don't think that really dampens your point. I think I just wanted to offer that clarification. Jacob, any last comments on the movie tonight?
Certainly, I'll be brief, but David, I think your remarks are well observed. Just one other piece of information that I wanted to bring to the table is that Cagney's origins were in comedy, and you can sort of, I think, in a way, the way that he handles dialogue and the sort of quickness with it and the expressiveness of it, you can sort of see that those roots are there. And, he's had some roles. He worked in musical comedy, and that's where he sort of began his career, much of it on the stage. But in a way, I think that, the quickness, the sharpness, the ability to really, twist a line and make it land, you can see, I think, those chops maybe from that comic training and that comic experience coming to bear in this sort of tougher edged, but still very fast, very punchy dialogue. So I'm glad you pointed that out.
Thanks for that, Jacob. And thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight, for helping us have what I think was a really engaged and interesting discussion of a film that I think I can safely say for all of us, we're all glad we saw. You can see on your screen some of the film studies offerings we have coming up. These are our Cinema Classic seminars, one night focus on a different feature film. These are available. These are happening on site, but you can also attend virtually. When you attend virtually, you get to hear the lecture before the film and the discussion after, though we can't show you the movie that people are watching in the theater while you're at home. But these are available both on site and remotely. So please consider checking them out. And we will be announcing more for the rest of 2021 within the next few weeks. If you want to find out about those and you want to find out about what else we're doing in education or in general at BMFI, please sign up for our emails. Every Thursday, we have an email dedicated to education. And this Thursday's email will let you know what next month's Film Studies Online discussion will be. So if you liked what we did tonight, please be sure to find out what we're doing next month for our free online discussion. Our movie theater is fully open. Right now, we are having a lot of people come see the new James Bond film. We're also showing a number of other interesting titles. We've got wonderful reserved seating, a very clear and appreciated by our patrons sort of system for dealing with COVID. And our Sundays and Mondays are called Vac Cinema, which is when you can come to the theater only if you can show proof of vaccination. If that is something that is very important to you when you go out to places. We are doing that currently on Sundays and Mondays. So you can find out about that and everything else we have going on at our website, brynmarfilm.org, and also sign up for our emails, as I said, because every Tuesday we send out our weekly email with the films that are coming up. So I think that does it for us tonight. If you like what we're doing and you have the means and inclination, we would certainly welcome any show financial support you would care to give. It lets us keep doing programs like this, as well as keep the theater running and showing very interesting films and offering great education opportunities. So thank you very much for joining us. Jacob, thank you for joining me tonight and for making a wonderful contribution to, I think, everybody's sort of film viewing experience by recommending this movie.
Thanks, Andrew, and thank you, all of you.
Thanks very much, everybody. Look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.